There's a specific kind of change that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a breakthrough. It doesn't feel like a turning point when it's happening. You notice it later, in the absence of something that used to be there. A thought that didn't follow the collapse. A morning that didn't begin with the weight of yesterday. A moment where you knew what you needed and didn't immediately talk yourself out of needing it. That's what this video is about. Not the diagnosis, not the vocabulary, not the moment of recognition. You may already have that. This is about what happens after. What actually shifts in the texture of ordinary days when a woman genuinely integrates understanding of her brain. Not as inspiration, as description. Specific enough to recognize. Honest enough to trust. So let's begin with the part no one talks about enough. What it took to even arrive here. First, before anything else, there is something that needs to be said about the journey to this point. Getting here wasn't free. The years of not knowing had a cost. The years of knowing something was different, but not having a name for it, also a cost. The diagnosis itself, if it came late, carried its own particular weight. Relief and grief arriving at the same time, which is one of the more disorienting things a person can feel. And then there was the work of understanding. Reading, researching, watching, listening. Building a vocabulary for something you had been living without language for decades. That work is not small, and it's worth naming that before anything else, because a lot of the content about ADHD and understanding skips straight to what's possible without acknowledging what it took to get to the threshold. You spent years collecting evidence against yourself. The late assignments, the abandoned systems, the relationships that absorbed the overflow of an unrecognized brain, the performance of competence that cost more than anyone saw. Here is something that almost no one says out loud. Understanding your ADHD brain does not immediately feel like relief. For a lot of women, the first real feeling is something closer to rage, followed by grief, followed by a strange, exhausting process of revising everything you thought you knew about yourself, using a completely different framework. That process takes time, and it takes more than time. It takes repetition. The new understanding has to be applied again and again to specific memories, specific failures, specific moments where the old verdict was the only explanation you had. That's what integration actually is. Not learning the concept once, returning to it until it replaces what came before. Which brings us to the part that might surprise you. Here is where this video is going to say something that a lot of transformation content won't. The brain doesn't change. Executive dysfunction doesn't disappear with understanding. Task paralysis is still task paralysis. The wall of awful is still real. Time blindness doesn't correct itself because you have a name for it. The hormonal fluctuations that make certain weeks feel impossible, those remain. The rejection sensitivity, the hyperfocus that arrives uninvited and abandons you mid-project, none of that gets erased by insight. So what exactly is the promise here? If the brain stays the same and the mechanisms stay the same, what is it that understanding actually changes? This is the question we're sitting with. Because the answer to it is the thing that most content on this topic never gets specific enough to name. The change is not in what the brain does. The change is in the relationship between you and what the brain does. And that distinction, which might sound abstract right now, is the difference between spending the next decade at war with a brain you can't change and spending it learning to work with the one you actually have. It makes complete sense that this sounds like reframing, like something a therapist says when they don't have anything concrete to offer. Stay with it, because when it becomes specific, when it arrives in the texture of an actual Tuesday, it doesn't feel like reframing anymore. It feels like finally being able to see the terrain instead of just hitting the ground every time it changes. And here's what that actually looks like when it starts to happen. Here is what actually shifts. The first thing, and the one that happens earliest, is the delay shortens. Before understanding, the sequence looked like this. The task didn't happen. The spiral arrived immediately. The spiral concluded with a verdict. The verdict became more evidence. The evidence was filed. The whole sequence could complete itself in under 4 minutes without a single conscious decision. After integration, something interrupts that sequence. Not always, not perfectly, but with increasing frequency. There is a moment, sometimes just a moment, between the thing that didn't happen and the story about what that means. And in that moment, something different becomes available. Not fixing, not bypassing, just recognition. This is the mechanism. This is what this is. That moment is what the years purchased. Not a fixed brain, A beat of space between the event and the verdict. That space is not small. That space is where a different life begins to happen. The second thing that changes is the weight of the restart. Before understanding, every collapse was also a referendum. The system failed, which meant you failed, which meant this was evidence of something permanent about you. So the restart had to carry the weight of proving that this time would be different. That you had finally learned that the failure was an anomaly, not a pattern. No system can survive that kind of loading. After integration, the restart is still a restart. The thing still fell apart. That's still real, and it still costs something. But it stops being a verdict. The restart is the cycle, not the proof of the problem. And a restart you can enter without dragging every previous collapse behind you is a different thing entirely. The third thing, and this one is the one that takes the longest, is that she begins to know what she actually needs, not what she's supposed to need, not what the system requires, not what worked for her colleague or her sister or the woman in the video, what her brain specifically needs to function, the conditions for focus, the recovery time after social performance, the particular way her energy moves across a week, or across a hormonal cycle, or across a project with no external deadline. That knowledge doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, quietly, from paying attention to what actually works instead of what's supposed to. And here is the thing that changes everything. The one underneath all of the others. The woman she always suspected was underneath the performance? She was never a fantasy. She was always there, working differently, needing different conditions, seeing things from a vantage point that the mask kept obscuring. Understanding didn't create her. It cleared the way. That is the emotional climax of the diagnosis when it finally lands. Not, now I am fixed. But I was never broken. The brain was real. The cost was real. And the woman who survived both of those things, she was real too. The whole time. If what this video is describing is something you want to move through rather than just understand, there is a 6-week structured program in the description below. It's built for exactly this threshold, the place where you know what happened and you're ready to do something with that knowledge. Not harder, not more, but differently with the brain you actually have. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Now let's talk about what all of this looks like when it meets the complexity of real life. None of this is linear. That's worth saying directly, because one of the things that makes the ADHD brain particularly vulnerable to hope is the expectation that change will be consistent, that once something shifts, it stays shifted. It doesn't work that way. There will be weeks where the collapse is as total as it ever was, where the space between the event and the verdict disappears completely, where the restart feels as catastrophic as it did before any of this. That is not evidence that the understanding failed. That is the cycle, which is different from the failure. And here is what integration actually provides in those weeks. Not prevention, not a system that holds through everything, but a faster return. The recognition that arrives sooner than it used to. The restart that doesn't require you to rebuild the entire case for your own competence from scratch before you can begin again. The gap between the floor and the next attempt gets shorter, not because the floor stops appearing, but because you stop requiring yourself to prove something was an anomaly before you're allowed to move again. There's an internal objection that belongs here. The thought that says, even if this is true, I don't know if I can actually change at this point. I'm 41, or 38, or 29 with a decade of this already behind me. What if the window has closed? Here is what that question is actually asking. It's asking whether the brain can change. And the answer to that question is beside the point, because what changes is not the brain. What changes is what the brain costs you and what it makes available to you when you stop treating it as the enemy and start treating it as the specific, difficult, capable thing it actually is. What change looks like in ordinary life is this. A Thursday where the wall of awful arrives and you recognize it before you're inside it. A conversation where the rejection sensitivity fires and, somewhere underneath the feeling that the feeling is real and the verdict is not. A week where everything falls apart and you restart on Saturday without spending Friday building the case for why you're allowed to. A morning where you make contact with what you actually need, not what you're supposed to need, and act on it without apology. That's what changes. Not all at once, not permanently, not without cost, but consistently enough over time that the woman who shows up to her own life starts to feel like someone she recognizes. If you want a structure for moving through this, not faster, but more completely, The link in the description and the pinned comment is the next step. The video showed you the shape of what's possible. That's where the work of getting there lives. What's one thing that has quietly shifted for you since you started understanding your brain? Even if it's so small you almost didn't notice it. There are years in this you won't recover. The version of yourself who moved through her 20s without knowing what was happening in her brain, she is not coming back. The jobs, the relationships, the private record of failures that accumulated before anyone named what they were looking at. Those years had a cost that understanding does not erase. That grief is legitimate. It belongs here, in this conversation. It doesn't have to be resolved before you're allowed to move forward. And here's what is also true. The evidence you collected against yourself was never evidence of who you are. It was navigation, in the dark, without a map, with a brain that required conditions no one around you knew to provide. That you are still here, still asking questions, still returning to the work, still holding the careful hope that something can shift, is not a small thing. It is actually one of the more extraordinary things a person can do with a brain that has been working this hard for this long with this little support. You don't need to start over. Starting over implies you're back at zero, that what came before counts for nothing. You start again, from here, which means you start with everything you now know. Every collapse that taught you something about the cycle. Every restart that proved you were capable of one. Every moment of recognition that arrived even briefly, even imperfectly, even too late to change what had already happened. That knowledge is not nothing. That knowledge is what makes this attempt different from the last one. The woman underneath the mask was always the real one, not the one who performed competence at cognitive cost no one saw. Not the one who apologized for the things her brain did before she understood what her brain was doing. Not the one who filed every failure as permanent evidence. The one who always suspected there was something else underneath. The one who kept returning, even after the collapses. The one who is watching this video, right now, still asking whether something can be different. That one. She was never the problem. Not evidence. Navigation. And she is still here, which means the map is still in use.